Never could two centuries contrast with each other so much. The 17th century folklore, terror, torture, murder, execution, it's all centred around about demonology. The 18th century in Scotland, the Enlightenment, self-evidence, common sense. We're an educated country. 100 years makes such a difference. 17th century is centred around about the Witchcraft Act and one man, James VI. 1597, he writes a book, Demonology. It's all about how to spot witches, how to identify and what to do with them. The most important thing you do, thou shalt not suffer a witch to live. James VI was absolutely passionate, get rid of all the witches, as he saw. Some men took it incredibly seriously. This man here, William Adair. On his watch, 15 women in the town were accused, and the probability is 10 or 11 of them would have been executed. But it's not just the town of Ayr. You've got 78 in the Presbytery of Ayr. You've got 153 in the county of Ayr. Masses and masses of terror going through the town. The probability is 65% of them were executed by means of being strangled and that burnt at the stake. But we know about one set of trials, one set of witchcraft trials, those in Salem in Massachusetts in America at the end of the 17th century. We know about that, but in that time, only 20 of them were executed for witchcraft. 20. If we look at those statistics, the likelihood is 18 in the town of Ayr were executed, 52 in the Presbytery of Ayr, and over 100 in the county. Why do we tell our kids about the Citadel and the Salem witch trials, where it's much, much more relevant in these streets that we still walk? Why do we do that? I don't know. Somebody wrote a play about it, but we have to do more. We have to tell our kids more and more about what happened in their own town. But the problem is we don't really understand it. We don't understand what happened. So let's put it in a 20th century context. Around about 1958, there's a troubled wee girl in Perth. And this happens with girls in their early 20s. Sometimes she takes it too far. And what does she do? She puts a gun to her stomach and pulls the trigger. A gunshot wound is a horrible thing. It obliterates the inside, and it takes a real specialism to deal with gunshot wounds. But this is only 13 years after the World War II. So there are experts all over Scotland and all over Britain who were war surgeons in World War II. One of those, and the best, is Professor Kerr. And he is police escorted from Edinburgh to Perth to operate on this poor wee girl. There's one reason for that. She's a cousin of the Queen's. Really important girl. What happens is she walks into the surgery, and there is a theatre sister called Margaret, who has never worked with anybody like this before, but is young and is known to be absolutely superb at her job. Professor Kerr starts work. Margaret says she has never ever seen anybody work as quickly, as expertly, and as cleanly as Professor Kerr. She was almost in awe, but she was on point. She had to do her job, and she assisted them throughout. Critical part of the operation, what happens is he's trying to tie off a part of the wound, and because he's a big man, because there's a degree of urgency, this thread breaks. Tries it again, the thread breaks again. During this point, Margaret has actually worked out that she's got some synthetic thread that has never been used before, and she decides to give that to Professor Kerr. He takes it, looks at her, tries to sew it off, and it holds. Now there's a look between Margaret and Professor Kerr that she will cherish for the rest of her life. It's respect. And a wee girl needs that. Trouble is, there's no happy ending to this. Because whilst the operation's a success and she's healed of the gunshot wound, what happens is she dies of an infection that night. There's certainly no happy ending because 6 years later her mother takes her own life in the same room by the same means. It's horrible. It's horrible. So, where are we here? Let's look at Margaret in the 17th century. We can stop here. She is a healer. She's a midwife. She's actually known as quarrelsome. She's been involved in an operation with royalty, and that wee girl and her mother lost her life. In the 17th century, there would have been so many reasons for her to have been accused of witchcraft. And if she was the wrong way, she could have actually ended up at the stake burning. Terrible, terrible times. But Margaret has two things in her favour. One, she's young. And two, she's beautiful. And that makes a difference in 17th century Scotland. 60% of those executed for witchcraft were over the age of 40. Life expectancy at that time is no more than 32. So this is the elderly population of here that this happens, of Scotland, that this happens to. Let's look at another woman, Janet Sloane. Now she's first accused of witchcraft in 1651, but for some reason she survives that and goes on to live for another 8 years. 1659 is a different matter. She's up against the town again, and just over there in what's called the toll booth, I have a pic, which would have been right in the middle of the street like that. She is accused, found guilty, held, and then eventually executed. She would have been walked down this road to around about the town hall. She would have been strangled just before a pyre of wood, and her body would have been burnt at a pyre of wood. Why? Well, she was known as quarrelsome. She was known as being possessed. Do you know, nowadays would call her having a pretty decent temper. She might have snapped at you a couple of times, but in the 17th century that could have actually seen you accused. You could have been quarrelsome. She also had property. We know she had property. People wanted that property, so this might have been a property dispute. And she would have been taken down here, and she would have been taken to this point. Market Cross, where the funeral pyre would have been, and she would have been burnt at the stake. Terrible times. Absolutely terrible times. What do we know about Janet? Number of things. She was tortured. She would have been tortured by something like this. A 6-inch spike that would have been pricked all over her body, again and again and again, until they found a part of it that wouldn't blemish. That was called the witch's mark, and that could actually get you executed on its own. But let's look at the 17th century. I said to you 60% were over the age of 40. There was only 7% of people that were executed that were under the age of 20. 20 to 30, it was 8%. And then the remainder were all the old in the community. It wasn't a good thing to grow old in that community, because if people were bitter and jealous, they could use the Witchcraft Act to go for you. And if you were a woman And 84% of those that were actually convicted were women. If you were a woman, that could see you away. A brutal death. Tortured, kept awake for hours and hours and days on end, to the point of delirium, to the point that you were asked, are you a witch? Are you a witch? Are you a witch? After 3 days of being kept awake, you would have just said, yes, I'm a witch. But that would have been enough to convict you. But not only that, what would have happened is she would have been said, now who else is a witch? And we know in Jonnett's trial, 2 others were implicated by the confessions of another witch. Was it Jonnet? I don't know. Was somebody else the person that implicated Jonnet? I have no idea. But Jonnet died a brutal death. What's tragic about this was there were 10 men and 14 women that testified against her. One of those women was her daughter. Can you imagine sitting in the dock and watching a wee girl that you'd brought up testify against you? Maybe she's the one that wanted her property. I have no idea. But they used the Witchcraft Act to see to an end Jonnet. But let's look at Margaret now. Margaret is now 62 years later. Margaret's been a mother. She's a grandmother. She's a widow. And she owns property. Now what happened with Jonnet is her ashes were brought up to the old brig and they were tipped into the River Aire, never to sully the town again. Margaret, she was known as quarrelsome, there's no two doubts about that. She was confident, she was headstrong, she was still a healer, she would have still been known as a midwife. She could have been called anything. But I'm pleased to say that I've always called her Mum.